All right, Algebra 1 students, let's look at Unit 4, Lesson 10, Domain and Range, Part 1. So our lesson goals here are, I know what is meant by the domain and range of a function. So one of the first things that we have to understand is, what exactly does the word domain mean and what does range mean? So once we understand those two words, it should open up our learning within this lesson. Number 2. When given a description of a function in a situation, I can determine reasonable domain and range for the function. So one of the big things we need to be able to do with domain and range is figure out what numbers seem reasonable in this situation to represent our domain and range of a function. Our vocabulary. Domain is all possible input values. So your domain is referencing typically all your possible x values that could represent the x value in our problem, otherwise known as our input. Range is all possible output values. So this is looking at all the possible outputs or y values that could be represented within our situation. All right, our warm-up here is, earlier you saw a situation where the total number of times a dog has barked was a function of the time in seconds after its owner tied its leash to a post and left. Less than 3 minutes after he left, the owner returned, untied the leash, and walked away with the dog. So our goal here is, if you remember this situation from some days ago, we want to figure out what are some acceptable values that could be used for the input and the output here. And we just want to explain why we think those values are acceptable or unacceptable. So, could each value be an input time of the function? So remember, the inputs here were the times. So 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. So there are 3 possible inputs that I'm asking about. Would 15 seconds be an input that would make sense for this situation? Would 84.5 seconds be an input that makes sense for this situation? And would 300 seconds be an input that makes sense for this situation? Please explain why you think each of these numbers is or is not an acceptable input. Second, could each value be an output, barks, of the function? So the output would be the number of barks that the dog had while it was tied up. Each of these numbers could represent an output. You need to tell me whether they're an acceptable number for the output. So would 15 barks be an acceptable output value here? Explain your reasoning, yes or no. B, 84.5 barks. Would that be an acceptable output? Yes or no, and explain why. And lastly, 300 barks. Would that be an acceptable output? Explain your reasoning, yes or no. Please explain why you think these numbers are good or bad inputs and outputs, and then bring that to class tomorrow. That will start our discussion. Thanks.